June Brown on June 29th, 1993. Interviews held in Los Angeles, Silver Lake. The interviewer is John Milner. June, could you tell me how you became interested in becoming a social worker?
Well, I don't know that there was a particular time that I decided that I would become a social worker. But as a youngster growing up in Los Angeles and kind of getting to the age that I became conscious of the world around me was in the early and middle 30s when the Social Security programs, I am sure, were beginning to be activated in the city. And I can remember a group of young African-American women who began to go to work in the social services. And these were people that I knew, and it really seemed rather glamorous in some ways. They were young, they were excited about their jobs. In order to have the job, it was preferred that you have a car, so a number of them had cars, and for a 7-year-old that really seemed like really quite a good thing to aspire to. So I think, from those very early years, I made a connection with young women making a choice to go into social services, and it looked like a choice that appealed to them, and as a youngster it looked really quite appealing to me. But certainly at that point in life I did not say that I wanted to be a social worker, and I didn't make a conscious decision about it until after I graduated from UCLA. I was a Spanish major at UCLA and had intended to go into secondary education and become a Spanish teacher in high school. But when I graduated, in order to get a secondary credential, one had to, do a year postgraduate work. And I was ready to go to work. So I went out on the job market with this BA in Spanish and not really any skills to go along with the Spanish. And I finally, or I quickly learned that nobody was terribly interested in somebody who spoke Spanish without accompanying skills. So I really was looking for a range, or looking at a range of jobs when I left with my BA. And among the things that I did was to take the civil service examination for the then Bureau of Public Assistance. I passed the examination, and sometime in October of 1948, I had graduated in the summer of 48. Sometime in October, I received a telegram from the Belvedere district, signed by a Francis Lomas, giving me an appointment to come out for an interview. Belvedere district was quite a long ways from where I lived, and the big issue I was discussing with my friends was, for this interview, did they think I really needed to wear stockings and high-heel shoes, or if I could get away with a skirt and loafers? And they persuaded me that that'd be a better part of prudence if I wore some stockings and some dress shoes. So I tried to put forth this business image and took this long trip out to Belvedere. Met Miss Lomas, who was quite an imposing but a warm figure, and we had a discussion. I got not much sense of how she had evaluated the interview, but she suggested that there were other people to be interviewed and I would hear from her later. That was October. On November 5th, I received a telegram that said that she had selected me for the position and I should plan to report for work on December 1st. Well, I was just very sure this was Providence operating because November 5th was my 21st birthday. And I decided what a wonderful birthday present, because I had been unemployed from June until November, so you can imagine by this time I was very pleased to have a job offer. I mentioned this to Frances years later about what serendipity it was that the telegram had come on my birthday. And she calmly told me that it wasn't serendipity at all. She had timed it because she had to wait until I was 21 so I could be deputized. I can remember the social work job began at $211 a month, and there were salary increments for 5 years from $211, the second year $222, the third year $233, the fourth year $245, to a high of $255 after 5 years. Coming from a weekly allowance of $1 a week when I was going to UCLA, when we, kind of got rides from our friends and pooled our money for lunch, this seemed like just untold wealth.
You were a rich lady.
just among the newly rich. I was able to go to Belvedere, according to Frances, precisely because of my Spanish major. At that time, the district had the largest family caseload of any district in the county. But it consisted of East Los Angeles, Montebello, and Whittier, and the Spanish-speaking population was really a large part of the clientele that was served. So although during my months of job search in the summer, when I was beginning to be very discouraged by this Spanish major, that indeed was the only selling point by which I was chosen for this position, and turned out to be the basis of one of the most interesting parts of my work life, the almost 5 years that I spent in Belvedere.
Yes. I was interested in your saying that you wondered whether you should wear high heels and a hat, because I know when Arlene Johnson was dean at the University of Washington, and students in field work were required to wear a hat and gloves and high-heel shoes. And when she came to California in the late 1930s to head USC school, she was shocked that the social workers dressed more informally.
Okay.
Could you tell me some of the sequence of positions that you held in social work after you left Belvedere?
All right. I stayed in Belvedere about 5 years. I think it was in the early 50s that my supervisor, I had two supervisors in Belvedere, Mr. Teese for about a year, Kurt Teese was his name, And his mother had been Sophia Vantis, who was one of the early luminaries in child welfare from Columbia University. And Mr. Teese, carried an aura of social work that you would find absolutely admirable. So I worked with him for about a year, and then I was transferred to the unit of Lucy Eason. Mrs. Eason was an African-American woman of great charm and great strength, and she and I bonded, very, very firmly. So after about 3 years, she began to say, you've got to move on, you've got to take the supervisor's examination, because if you don't, you'll sit around here until, and she called the name of one man who was kind of a joke around the place, you'll sit around here until he's your supervisor. So you better take this exam and move on to the next step. So I took the supervisor's examination some 4 or 5 years into my work with the Bureau, and I passed it, and in time I was transferred downtown to what was relatively new then, the Metro South District at Adams and Grand, and I supervised an ADC, an Aid to Dependent Children's unit of about 5 or 6 workers there until about 1959, when I took a leave to go to the School of Social Work. I had worked for the Bureau for about 11 years when I decided to go and get my MSW.
Excellent. Were you pleased with the school you found after having had practical experience? Did you find school helpful to you?
Very pleased with the experience. I think very few people have gone through the School of Social Work at USC without the dual experience of feeling very benefited by what was taught and what they learned. But in addition to that, I think what has characterized that school historically is the sense of privilege of working with the caliber of people who have been a part of that faculty. And certainly I came away with a sense of much pride and in having had the exposure, not only to the educational experience, but to the faculty who, as I look back in retrospect, we have evolved from being strangers to being to a student-teacher relationship, eventually to a collegial relationship, and finally the fast friendships really that have developed among us. And I don't think that is unique to me. I feel that most people who have had the experience of getting their social work education at that school has seen the experience as more than just education. It has been more than that. And I think it is central to my sense of pride and privilege as a social worker, but really as a person.
Yes. Was Arlene Johnson the dean of the school at the time you entered?
No, it was just the transition. It was her. She had just resigned, and Malcolm Stinson had just come. It was his first year, and I went to the school on an accelerated program. We began in January, as I remember. We went the spring semester, and then there were 2 summer semesters where we did our first year. And I was placed at the American Red Cross. Then the second year we did in the traditional time, and I was placed at the California Youth Authority.
I think I used to call that the Hop Dept program.
Yeah, maybe so. And Lisa McBroom taught most of the first year classes, as I recall. She taught practice, she taught the behavior, and we began to refer to ourselves as Lisa McBroom social workers.
What was your thesis topic?
Well, now you should remember that because you were my second member. As I'm sure you know, Norris was my chair. And
this is Norris class.
Norris class was the chair. He probably gave me the topic. You know how he was. And I looked at it this morning before I came over here to, kind of clear my memory, and sure enough, it was signed by Norris class and John Milner. The topic was the juvenile offender's perception of his day in court. And it, from, my placement at Youth Authority, I interviewed 10 boys with a questionnaire on really how they had perceived what was the charge, or what were the charges that led them to court, how they remembered the court experience, and some assessment of what the juvenile court, how it is perceived by a minor in relation to its intended role in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Following getting your master's degree in social work, what did you do?
Well, I didn't have much choice. And it's funny that every era has its own burdens. In that time, as I look back now, there was such social sanction for social work, and that the social sanction was really expressed by the support that the society gave to people who were making this choice. I suppose the society broadly, even then, didn't quite understand why people wanted to be social workers. But if you wanted to do this, they did recognize, in a way that I don't think society recognizes today, the contribution that social work had made, and the contribution that social work was in a position to make to the society. So social work education was adequately subsidized in those days, certainly not lavishly, but so that you could make the choice to follow this profession, and that the education was made accessible. So when I came to school, I came on a Children's Bureau scholarship, which took care of SC's full tuition and provided us a monthly stipend. Now, the monthly stipend was not lavish, but since you were so busy with your school responsibilities, it was quite enough, because it took care of shelter and basic needs, and you didn't have time for much else. But of course, and that original stipend from the original Social Security Act was supposed to be available only for people who were going to do child welfare in rural areas. But they had been able to interpret that within Los Angeles County there were indeed rural areas. So in that way, I was able to qualify for one of the Children's Bureau scholarships, and the expectation was that you would work in the Child Welfare Agency 1 year for each year of education. So I knew immediately that when I finished school, I would be going to the Los Angeles County Division of Child Welfare Services, and I did.
How long was it before you decided to go on for an advanced degree?
Well, I worked for the agency from 1961 and did not resign until about 1968. And I got my MSW in the spring of 1961. Harriet Erickson was the director of the agency, and Marion Peterson was the associate director. And the Division of Child Welfare Services had been organized about 1957. Before 1957, there was a child welfare unit in every district office of the Bureau of Public Assistance. But because that represented so many different models of administration, the Child Welfare Services really reflected the individual notions of the district directors of what child welfare should be. Some year or so before 1957, the county reorganized child welfare system services into a separate division. And so Erickson and Peterson were given the administrative slots, and they had a child welfare service that was located geographically in each of the 11 districts throughout the county. But instead of them representing the whole range of administrative styles of various directors, the 11 units were under the single direction of these women. And the reason I mention that is the first thing that they did when they organized the new division, which was a part of the Bureau of Public Assistance, which was a part of the Department of Charities. But when it moved to its own administrative structure, the first thing they did was to request consultation from the U.S. Children's Bureau and from the Child Welfare League as to how their plan accorded with professional standards of practice. The first study was done in 1957 by Edna Hughes of the Child Welfare League of America. She found a few areas that needed correction in order to meet standards, but gave them a provisional membership. And they had until the next year to meet the standards. And by 1958, and we have in the archives at the School of Social Work Library those two studies, the 1957 study and the 1958 accreditation. From 1958 until about 1968, that agency was one of the few public agencies that was a fully accredited member of the Child Welfare League of America, meeting all the standards of professionalism in terms of program, facility, personnel that the league required. So I feel that I was really, again, quite fortunate to have gone into that service at a time that its standard of professionalism would match the standard of practice in any child welfare agency.
Mm-hmm. What encouraged you to go on for an advanced degree?
I worked for the department for about 3 years, and then I went up to the State Department of Social Welfare and worked there for about a year
That was in Sacramento.
In Sacramento. And at that time, California had been one of the first states to establish public adoption services. So I worked with the adoption part of the department as well as the child welfare part. Lucille Kennedy, I think, was the head of the adoption service, and Margaret Ballard was the director of child welfare services. And that was when the state was fairly active in supervising the 58 counties to assure that there was at least a minimum standard that services met. And of course, in those days, the Children's Bureau still was in charge of child welfare grants, and they only granted money for child welfare services if the programs met their standards. So in the 50s and through until the late 60s, there was federal accountability. There were federal standards and there was accountability. There was state supervision and accountability. So you got the local agencies working autonomously and in relation to their own needs, but there was a strong modicum of state actively involved in supervising the quality of program, and the federal government, the Children's Bureau, really quite active at that time. After a couple of years, I really decided that supervisory role I didn't like that much, and besides I got homesick. So I came back just before I would have had to resign from the county, and went back to the Child Welfare Services Division. And that second time, I went to McLaren Hall, which was the very beginning of the Child Welfare Agency setting up its own shelter care program. McLaren Hall now is a huge institutional facility. Then it was a tiny little place that really had been part of Sister Kenny's polio treatment.
Yes,
Yeah,
I remember.
You remember that. And if the police had to pick up children in the middle of the night, they would bring them to McLaren Hall. But we really had to remove them from that institutional setting to foster homes within 72 hours. So I worked with that for about 2 years. And, I was pleased enough with it. And this is not going to be terribly scholarly or impressive, but I don't know why, but I was working on a committee, an alumni committee that was doing something for the school. And I went over one afternoon to take a report or something. And I'm sure I hadn't been back at the school since I graduated until I went for this meeting. And I was sitting there waiting for the meeting to begin, and Norrie Class came out of his office, and he saw me, and he says, "Oh, hello." He says, "Come back here, I have something for you." So I went back to his office. He said, "I've got this scholarship from the Children's Bureau that you can have to go back for doctoral study."
Wonderful.
And I said, "Well, I don't even know what doctoral study is, and I don't even know what kind of jobs one would aspire to after you have it." He says, "That doesn't matter. You've done this practice long enough, and I have this scholarship, and it's yours." Well, as we all remember Norris, how positive he was about it. I don't think it was his scholarship. but he did know.
He claimed a lot of things.
He claimed a lot of things. But evidently, Annalise Sandusky, who had joined the Children's Bureau in the middle 50s, as I understand. Mrs. Sandusky, again, was an African-American social worker who had come out of the Atlanta School of Social Work and gone and joined the Children's Bureau. And there were three things that seemed to have characterized her career as I read it. I looked at her with such awe in those days until I didn't ask her much, but in later years have read her writings. And coming out of social work education, evidently, it seems to me, and you would know better because she was a colleague of yours, it seems to me that she brought the social work educator's perspective to the Children's Bureau. The notion that it was very important that the child welfare curriculum reflect the needs of child welfare practice. So she seemed to have been very concerned with enriching or expanding through Child Welfare Bureau or Children's Bureau scholarships, expanding the child welfare faculty resource nationwide. So she evidently was wanting to use those funds to locate people who would be willing to go into social work education, but to take child welfare with them into the system. The second thing I gathered that was of concern to her was the fact that child welfare had been a very meager resource for children of color, that African American children, American Indian children, Hispanic children, and Asian children had received very little of the services, particularly from the private agencies. If we, look and know that the center of the system had been the Eastern Seaboard and had been pretty much organized to serve European immigrant children, and certainly in California we didn't have a large system of private agencies. So her concern not only was her concern to expand the resource of child welfare concerned faculty in schools of social work, but she was looking for people who would have a particular interest in expanding child welfare's reach of protection and help to children of color. So I suspect that Norrie assumed that he'd have a good argument as to why I should have those scholarships. And as I read it, the third thing that she was about, which was close to where my thinking was coming, was that public social services were a vast, untapped resource to enable families to stabilize and to be safe and nurturing environments for children. So her writings indicate that she was very focused toward including services to children in their own homes as a component of child welfare practice. And by the time I had practiced for the number of years I had, I certainly didn't have a sense that there was no place for out-of-home care. But I did have a sense that the complement of services to determine a family's capacity to grow and improve as a nurturing place for its children and to hopefully strengthen that potential was as important to practice as the skill in foster care, residential care, and adoptions. So it was the opportunity to go into doctoral study that fit kind of where I felt I saw things. So unlike many people, it wasn't that I decided that I wanted to be an academic. It was a kind of serendipity of things.
An accidental.
An accident that I happened to be sitting there when Nori Class walked out of his office and said, "Oh, come here, I have something for you."
Wonderful.
Yeah, and indeed it turned out to have been an opportunity that I have appreciated as I look back.
Were you pleased with the doctoral training, the doctoral education?
Yes. Again, it was different. They wouldn't even talk to you about that program unless you could quit your job and come full-time. And it was the Children's Bureau Fellowship that made that possible. I think there were 10 of us in that class, and we were together for 2 years, took all the same classes. In some ways you feel the exposure to the same group as gets to be a bit much, but at the same time there certainly were bonds that were forged in those 2 years that have lasted, this whole career. The instruction, again, was not as new to me as it was to others because I knew the faculty, rather knew what to expect. But doctoral study was different. It aimed at different things. And the old relationships that I had with Norris and with you and with Lisa McBurney and Helen Northern were just rather deepened, and it was an opportunity, and I certainly did take the opportunity to learn the basics and to appreciate social work in a way that you're not taught to appreciate it in the master's program. I think in the master's program you're taught how to do things. In the doctoral program, you really, or at least I got a sense of how social work has evolved and the effort and the success that has gone into its building a knowledge base from which to teach people how to do things.
And your dissertation subject?
California adoptions, 1870 to 1969.
That's an interesting area of study.
Mm-hmm.
What were the great differences between the early adoptions and later adoptions that you discovered?
The early adoption law was just to complete the codes in California. It was just a legal strategy to give legal standing to the rare instances when people adopted. What evolved to be pretty clear was that an adoption law required adoption services. And so really tracing a century of the evolution of the law and the complementary evolution and development and refinement of social services, including the problems and the unmet needs in adoptions, was what one really learned. In California, until World War II, adoptions was completely a private agency enterprise. And adoption, which in all of those years was looked at as the best of service that could be provided a dependent child, was really restricted to a very small group of white infants who could pass the psychological test at 6 weeks, assuring adoptive parents that they were not psychologically or mentally impaired, who were physically perfect, who could be, physically matched, generally to a privileged group of adoptees. The two agencies that served, one was a voluntary an agency of volunteers. The other was a private agency, but it was staffed by paid staff. And by World War II, the agency that was staffed entirely by volunteers had pretty much disappeared from the scene, and so we just really had the Children's Home Society as the only agency. At the same time, social change had occurred that trafficking in babies was just a state scandal. And then it was determined that no minority children were getting access to this kind of legal alternative. So with these two serious flaws in adoptions, there was a statewide study that eventually recommended the establishment of public adoption services in California. I think California was one of only 3 states that by 1947 had broadened the access to adoptions by establishing public services.
Almost seems unbelievable. We were that slow to do it.
Yeah. And that as slow as we were pioneers in the country.
Yes. Yes. And in your thesis, in your dissertation, did you do any writing related to it in articles?
1 or 2.
Can you say where these were published?
I think in social work papers. We did it on the place of adoptions in contemporary child welfare services, and I don't remember the year, but
yes. And more recently, you completed writing a book.
Not writing it. I shared with my colleague Marie Wild in editing a book that all of the members of the faculty who taught in the second year of Family and Children's Services in concentration contributed. And what it is our perspective of what child welfare services ought to be given the current status of American families and the consequences of this for children, and a description of the curriculum as we've taught it since 1980 in preparing people for practice in this way, in response to the needs of contemporary American families.
The title of the book
is Family Practice. I forget the rest.
Yes, so that's good. And that was published by what publishing company?
Child Welfare League of America.
And what year?
92.
92. Okay, good. June, do you feel that the system that provides services to families today has improved or has it declined?
Well, I think nationwide it's fairly broadly acknowledged that child welfare services in the public arena particularly are in crisis and have been in crisis for at least through the 70s and the 80s. There was some question as to what were the obstacles that may have existed to practice when I practiced. I think when the nation moved to accept child protection as a public responsibility at the end of the 19th century, that move reflected a sense of deep concern that children should not suffer cruelty, neglect, and that when it appeared that this happened, that the society really had an obligation to intervene. 125 years later, we probably thought that was an easier task to resolve than it turned out to be. A lot of complexity involved. But by the time I went into practice, the part of the task that we dealt with was clearly a narrow focus. We really were a placement agency. Harriet Erickson and Marion Peterson were just beginning 2 pilot units to do protective services when their era ended. But by and large, child welfare had been out of home care, and that had been our concern. We did very little, nothing about helping families in the early phases of problems. But much of what's talked about in terms of practice now, in terms of permanency and continuity, as you know, you taught us that. We always knew that children needed permanency and continuity in their lives. And so insofar as the defined task was organized, the agency did it with a real commitment to quality. So I didn't see any obstacles to carrying out that function at the time. But as we moved into the 60s, and there were major amendments to the Social Security Act and the expansion of the task from the small child welfare caseloads to the broader issues of child protection. The quality, instead of our being able to build on the quality that existed, the quality was sacrificed to the broader scope of services. At the same time, as I remember the late 60s, there was a great deal of status accorded to the neutral administrator, that the administrator need not know the program he was administering, but what he needed to be was an effective administrator, good at measuring cost effectiveness, and effective in the fiscal arena.
It's a business person.
A business person. And as the task expanded, the administration and leadership of social services shifted to these people who were administrators, not social workers. And one of the major occurrences that added to this complexity was the discovery of the battered child syndrome, kind of the uncovering of child abuse as being maybe more common than we had ever known as a society, the increase in reporting, and the burgeoning of the caseload. So you get a system of services that is weakening in terms of its standards, and a circumstance where families are more and more stressed, the requirement of reporting being emphasized, that the caseload is increasing rapidly, and the structure of the agencies to respond to this growing caseload in a professional way really being abridged. And I think, from my view of my career, the biggest disappointment has been to watch a system that was evolving, not being allowed to build on strength, but being dismantled into something that abandoned the notion of a quality standard for services.
So quality was sidetracked.
Absolutely sidetracked and abandoned. And we have seen with nationwide, we have seen the accounts of the tragedies that have occurred as the result of this. But apart from the headlines, what we can infer is that the quality of service for thousands of children has really been seriously abridged. Thousands, probably millions of children nationwide has been abridged. So my opinion is that it is tragic to never have had progress, but it is more tragic to have had progress and then regressed from that. And I think particularly in California, where a large part of our social service innovation and excellence has been in the public sector, to have lost a great deal of that in the last 25 years, to me has been probably the biggest disappointment.
Do you see any hope for change with regard to this?
Well, I think this has paralleled a time when our country has rejected the notion of the tie between public responsibility and individual well-being. That the notion of securing for families job opportunities, housing, accessible health care, the kinds of anchors that every family needs, the degree to which the country has abandoned that, the degree to which the economic necessity is that two parents work, have put burdens on families that simply didn't exist before. And so we see an incidence of the nurturing of children by family, by community, by schools, really being reduced to the point many children are not receiving the nurturance, the guidance that predict optimal development. So we see an increase of consequential problems, and although legislation of 1980 really prescribed a comprehensive social service response that began with preventive services to enable families to stabilize and remain together through the provision of protective services for seriously troubled families, through the provision of out-of-home care as a corrective measure, and the mandate for a permanent plan for children who have to be separated from their families. Although this was prescribed, the complexity of the task of implementing such services was such that really professional knowledge-based guidance was necessary. But this task was imposed on agencies that by this time had very little professional presence. And so we almost have a lay implementation of a very, very complex task. And one doesn't want to be critical without knowledge, but the sense is that the society has to recognize that child protection is essentially a social service, and it needs to be designed, planned, implemented, supervised, and held accountable by people who understand what the standards of quality social service are and are committed to that kind of implementation. That seems to me the task of the future. Human ingenuity has often been able to rescue serious problems and resolve them. And I think those of us who have invested our careers in this have to believe that what we've learned from the past will be used to be adapted to present and future needs, so that American society, and particularly California, which has had a rich tradition of a serious investment in its people, will return to that. I recently have agreed to be a member of the Children's Services Commission, representing Yvonne Burke on that commission. I don't know. I've not met with them, and I have no idea.
That's State Commission.
It's county.
The county, yeah.
It's the commission that gives oversight to the Department of Children's Services,
yes,
which was organized in 1984 with the hope that extracting child welfare from public welfare would give the agency a chance to build a comprehensive, quality, accountable service. I don't know and can't make a judgment at this point as to how the agency operates, but I'm looking forward to some participation in this commission.
I should say that would be your volunteer service.
That's my volunteer service.
Very good. You discussed some of your early career was in the correctional field. And it seems to me that here again, social work has moved away from active interest in corrections. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that really is a serious loss. I remember going to the youth authority with a lot of reservation. These were adolescent male delinquents who had, blown through county probation and been found seriously enough delinquent to go to the next step of the state facility. And what you found there were boys who responded well to kind structure, to reasonable, rational discipline, and to a model of life that they could follow. And the youth authority in those days, and particularly where they sent students, was concerned with a careful diagnosis of what appeared to be the family-child problem. And within the facilities of youth authority, designing a program to address these problems. And there was a treatment center right there on the spot where boys, this wasn't available to girls, it was only available to boys, could remain for a period of time for treatment, work with their families and all. And you saw the potential of that. Again, as child welfare services retreated from the investment, certainly corrections did, and with the Supreme Court decision on Galt that separated the status, that resulted in separation of status offenders from the youngsters who really were guilty of felonies or misdemeanor law infractions, has left that group, the group of status offenders, with no place to go, because juvenile corrections now really is self-defined as only dealing with minors who have broken the law, not minors who run away, who are truant, who do the kinds of things that indicate developmental problems, but really are not adjudicable.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the task for child welfare services is to become a lot more relevant to troubled adolescents, that they shouldn't have to go into a law enforcement, judicial, correctional system when the problems remain the problems of growth, development, and behavior of children. Child welfare has historically not been open a resource to troubled adolescents. And I think that is one of the tasks ahead for child welfare, is to equip itself to deal with the developmental issues of adolescents. Whether we look at drug abuse among adolescents, teen pregnancy, delinquency, in that whatever the expression, that's adolescent development going on. And we get all carried away with the teen pregnancy, with the drug addiction and all. But at the bottom line, it's the developmental task being distorted. And I think that child welfare is well equipped, or can equip itself to deal with the adolescent who is caught in a developmental dilemma.
Yes. You recognize what you've had to say, improvements in the adoption services over the years. How about the institutional care of children today?
That probably worries me in the extreme. But I think institutional care has always been a delicate task, like any of these. And this would go back to Nori's concern for licensing. That when institutions are not accountable, when the state really withdrew funding for the supervision, the accountability, you leave then individual institutions to their own devices. Some do well. Some are absolutely committed to quality. But I feel very, very strongly that it is a part of the public obligation to provide or to articulate standards, to provide supervision to see that minimal standards are met, and to provide consultation so that those agencies see the importance of moving from minimum adequate care to excellent care. And it's the matter, again, of equity. I think that every child's best protection is a family that functions well. And for those children who temporarily or in the long term lose a functional family, then it is the social service component that deals with putting together an alternative, a substitute. And it just occurs to me that when the state, moving toward this ethic of minimal government, really abandoned the supervision, the standard setting, supervision, consultation, that is essential to the licensing function. We have left many children unprotected. The whole issue of equity. The children that get into fine agencies are fortunate, but the children who don't have access to that really get a range of care. And I think the whole issue of equity in the standard of care, whether we're talking about services to children in their own homes, children in foster homes, children in residential care, children in adoption. The issue is the public obligation is to equity in the quality and accessibility of care. And I think residential treatment is probably the least equitable. Fine agencies, but there are other areas of care that are just unsuitable.
Recently, you retired from the University of Southern California. And you told me that once you retired, you're going to find a tree and sit under it. Have you found that tree?
There's not even a tree in my yard now.
No trees in your yard.
No trees in my yard.
Are you enjoying retirement so far? Because it's been how long?
It'll be 2 months, the
2
9th
months.
of July.
2 months.
The 9th of July. It'll be 2 months. The graduation was on Friday, May the 9th. I woke up Saturday morning, and it struck me that I don't have a job. And I don't even belong over there anymore. And for a couple of hours, I felt just lost and a little teary. And then I had to go do an errand. And I came back, and I don't know why, but I happened to look at my calendar book, and I had written down about 2 or 3 weeks ago, everybody in Inglewood, where I live, had received a notice that Maxine Waters and the mayor of Inglewood were having a public meeting on Saturday at 1:30, and so I wrote it down in case I could go, and I happened to look, and I thought, oh my goodness, I forgot this. That is too bad, it's too late, I can't go, I forgot all about it. And I thought, I can go. So kind of the sadness and the teariness left and hasn't returned. I've been almost obsessed with the notion of clearing the clutter out of my house and my life, So I'm still working on that. I have worked through the books. I had to sort books from work as to what I'd bring home. Then I had to get books away from home to make room for those coming to work. And I finished that. And now I'm working on papers, and that is really boring. But when I finish papers, then I'll just have a few odds and ends. It helps a lot when you're getting old and you can't remember where everything is, to have things at a place where it makes sense for them to be so you can find them. So I haven't really noticed much difference other than some tension of I'm doing this but I should be doing that has been relieved. And I'm looking forward to time to use as I choose to.
Have changes over the years occurred in the school that you look toward as being positive or possibly negative?
Well,
as they reflect social work education.
I think it's very important for people to realize and one thing I try to impress on or share with my students in terms of social decisions is that the single thing that characterizes the human condition is dynamic change. And if you resist that, then you find yourself just trying to push back the tides. And I really value, or at least as I've taught social policy, I look at the 20th century as I understand it, as little as I understand it, in relation to a whole suite of human progress, as historians tell us. It has evolved as really a very unique time in the affairs of people. And I think you and I have discussed that as children, we were probably among the most fortunate of children, largely because we were beneficiaries of what those people who laid the foundation for child welfare did. We're the children of ordinary people, not just privileged children, but children of ordinary families could look forward to an education, could look forward to health, could look forward to the freedom and the help to develop your potential and really choose from a variety of life paths. And I remember going through what some of those major turn-of-the-century reforms for children had been, which indeed were the work of those early child welfare leaders. And one student raised her hand with this kind of insight, and she says, "My goodness, that was a break with ancient traditions." And I think that's true. That
yes.
We were not hobbled as children with the handicaps that had just hovered over humankind. And certainly as an African-American child growing up, even in California when there were many limitations on what you could aspire to be, but there never was a question that if you got grades you could go to the University of California.
Sure.
We always knew as children that California had good schools and that our community was making an investment in the schools reciprocal, we also got the message that we expected to go there, behave, and learn. But even with the limitations of segregation, the assumption of a decent house, a good neighborhood, good schools, higher education if you were interested, and a job were just given us. And I think we were very fortunate in that.
There's always opportunity and hope.
There really was, and that you could plan your life.
Yeah.
If you made certain choices, you could expect
Achieve it.
to achieve this sort of thing. So I think as you look back on it, we were a fortunate cadre of children. I don't see life as this stable for children, but again, you have to have faith, I think, in the capacity of people to solve problems. And I have to believe that leadership will emerge that will put the country back on track, seeing the connection between social decisions and the potential for the development and enrichment of each individual.
And you're an eternal optimist.
It's hard to hold it. I mean, it really, you have to just believe in this capacity that people have shown in crisis over and over. But I don't see it now. But I have to assume that it has emerged in the past and it will emerge again.
Yeah.
It's possible that it will emerge again.
And you're cleaning house and so forth. Do you, if you find papers or photographs or literature of any kind that reflects on the history that we're trying to preserve on Social Work, could you remember to save it and present it to the school?
I surely will. And the two things that I have gathered that to me are the most important, and I already gave them to the library when they first came, and that is those two studies that the Child Welfare League made of the Child Welfare Services Division, describing the dimensions and components of the program and evaluating them in 1957 for the approval of the provisionary accreditation, and the year later the completing study that did accredit the agency. I just think it stands as an important, not only achievement, but statement of what can be achieved in public services. That in Los Angeles County, both the Child Welfare Services Agency and the Adoption Agency were not just provisional members, but they were accredited members, that they really had met standards. And it seems to me that that is an ongoing challenge to the public services, that it has been done, and it can be done again. So I have already contributed that. I will look always with an eye to the archives. I've become much more sensitive to the importance of that. I'm not sure that I have the kind of things, though, that are a part of that.
Well, I think you're in a period that's going to be history.
Maybe so, but
yeah.
I wrote to the Child Welfare League at the time the new department was formed. And they said normally they didn't, but given the significance of it,
Great.
they were kind enough to send us a copy.
Good, appreciate it. Thank you, June. Is there anything you'd like to add before we end?
No, other than to say thanks to you many people along the way who contributed to what I look on as a career that was a privilege and a pleasure to pursue.
We're proud of you.
Thank you.